I will be right back later.
It's like the Wizard of Oz. It's like the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, no, never mind.
Oh, you're gonna come out here and talk.
Yeah, so I'm hoping tomorrow goes well, because I leave later anyway.
It's always so mysterious.
I want to get them.
Trying to demystify things this
There
evening.
you go.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely spring night for the Winnipeg launch of Decolonizing Sport from Fernwood Publishing. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're particularly pleased to be launching this book here this evening. Thank you all for joining us here physically and virtually as well, to all of you watching on YouTube. Just to give you a quick sense of how the evening is going to go, there'll be a series of introductions just up here, and then we'll move along to a panel discussion with 3 of the editors of this volume. After that, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions if any occur. If you're here, please feel free to just put up your hand and I'll run to you with the microphone. That's not to call your ability to project into judgment. It just ensures that those watching at home can actually hear your questions in the first place. If you are one of those folks watching on YouTube and something does occur to you, please feel free to write it in the chat and we will put it to the editors as time permits. Now, I won't take up too much more of your time. Right now, we'll be back at the end with some scintillating notes about signing procedure. I will just say that it's always such a huge pleasure to work with Fernwood Publishing here at the store. They are one of the most important publishers, not only within the city, but also nationally, and we're thrilled to have a Fernwood Publishing location here in the city. Here to introduce the evening, I have the pleasure of calling up the publisher at Fernwood publisher at Fernwood Publishing, Wayne Antony. He is a founding member of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives here in Winnipeg, CCPA MD, and a board member since its inception in 1997. He's worked with other Winnipeg political activist organizations, the Socialist Education Centre and Thin Ice. He also taught sociology at the University of Winnipeg for 18 years. I could list all the reports that he has authored and the books he has co-edited, but I know I will get a side eye from Wayne, so I will avoid doing that. Rest assured, he has been involved in the creation of not only so many important books himself, but also through Fernwood itself. So please join me in welcoming Wayne Antony.
Thanks, John. Makes me sound done way more than I really have. There we go. I have some notes and I have my glasses. So first of all, thanks everyone for coming out to help us celebrate the release of Decolonizing Sport. Thanks, John, particularly John for organizing this launch and so many that I've done here and over the years. And thanks to McNally Robinson, this great space for doing book launches, and McNally Robinson has been so, I can't say enough, they've been so important to publishing and authors in Winnipeg. They provide such support for us, so thank you to them. And then on behalf of everyone at Fernwood, I want to say we're really pleased and proud to publish Decolonizing Sport. We think this is an important book. Christine, Janice, and Russell will tell you a lot more about the book. But one thing I'll say in doing this, working on this book with them, is I learned a lot. And in doing this book with them, I was thinking that there's probably a lot of people in this land, mostly settlers, who likely never think about colonization when they think about sport or participate in sport. And this book, through the fabulous stories that all the authors tell, show us pretty clearly that sport was intimately and integrally connected to colonization in this land. But I think more importantly, this book will spark conversations that can help us move on a different path towards decolonization. So on behalf of everyone at Fernwood, thanks to Russell and Christine and Janice for doing the book and for asking us to publish it and trusting us to take care of their words. On a more personal note, I'll say that I really enjoyed working on this book. It was a real pleasure. As I said earlier, I learned a lot, but also, doing a book is a difficult process. It requires a lot of conversations and long emails and email threads, and through all of that, the conversations that I had with these folks were interesting for sure, sometimes challenging, but always respectful, I thought. And we all intended that we wanted to do the book right. And I think we did. We did the book right. So thank you to the three of you for a great experience. So let me introduce Christine and Janice and Russell. Here I have to read you guys, sorry. Christine Obonsuin is a member of the Abenaki Nation of Odanak and is an associate professor of history and Indigenous studies at the University of Victoria. Christine's research focuses on the legal rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada and hosting the Olympics and other mega sporting events on unceded Indigenous territories. Janice Forsyth, a member of the Fisher Cree Nation, is a professor in Indigenous land-based physical culture and wellness in the Faculty of Education, School of Kinesiology at the University of British Columbia. She spent more than 20 years exploring the relationship between sport and culture from Indigenous points of view and translating that knowledge into action. In 2017, she was elected as a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada. Janice is co-author of A History of Excellence, The Untold Stories of Manitoba's Indigenous Sport, and author of Reclaiming Tom Longboat, Indigenous Self-Determination in Canadian Sport. And Russell Field is an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management at the University of Manitoba. His research explores sport and social justice, including the project A People's History of Sport in Canada. He's author of A Night at the Gardens, Class, Gender, and Respectability in 1930s Toronto, and co-author of The History and Politics of Sport for Development, Activists, Ideologues, and Reformers. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Christine, Janice, and Russell.
Thank you, Wayne. I've been tasked with going first. We've decided to go in order of height. And on the assumption that the most memorable things you hear will be the last things you hear. I wanted to thank lots of people. As we start, I want to thank McNally for hosting us. My family's watching from Toronto, and at the very least tonight, if nothing else, I'm able to lord over them that I've had West African peanut soup and they haven't. So that's a good thing. It's very good to be here. I want to thank Fernwood. This was a lot of fun for all its labor. Working with Fernwood, this was a really positive experience, at least from this side of the publishing process. Well, we're up here representing a number of people, all of whose names appear in this book. I'm not going to list all of them for you, though I'm quite fond of all of them and could be compelled quite easily to list all of them for you. I do want, and I know at least one is watching from England, so we're glad that Malcolm is joining us. I do want to shout out Murray Phillips, who's the fourth name that appears on the book, the cover of the book at least, the fourth of the four co-editors of this collection. And he may or may not be joining us from Brisbane. I have no idea. I don't have the slightest clue what time it is in Brisbane. I suspect it's lunchtime tomorrow, and that Murray may be surfing, but I have no true understanding of that. And I mentioned Murray because this collection, and it is a collection, there's, I believe, 16 people whose names appear on the table of contents. A collection, and in many ways a collective. This book grew out of an event that we had in Winnipeg on the campus of the University of Manitoba in May of 2018. When through a scholarly society that the three of us and Murray all belong to, provided us with some resources to host in advance of that society's annual conference, provided us with some resources to host a symposium on a topic important to the study of the history of sport and physical activity. And this collection has evolved considerably, but it had its origins there. And those origins are important because it wasn't a series of, much like I'm doing now in the most didactic way possible, series of people standing at the front of the room lecturing at you. It was a group of people who got together, wrote papers, shared them with one another in advance, workshop papers in an old school way. We should have had jackets with felt elbow patches, but it was wonderful to have that space. And we did it in some important spaces on the campus of the University of Manitoba, primarily in the round room at Mi'kmaq, the Indigenous Student Center. We also spent some time in the facilities of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where some important things were talked about and some powerful things were talked about. And I mentioned that we workshopped, that we were together as a community. And I think that's important for what's come out, what's ended up here, is it's a lot of people who worked separately in our academic worlds. It's quite common to be asked to submit a chapter to a book. It's very rare to meet any of the other people who've done that, or to have the editors of the book bring you all together to commune over your papers, to talk about how ideas could be developed. And I think that that's reflected in the power of the collection, certainly for me. And the other thing that I think is important is that that initial symposium had its life in academic publishing in a particular place. And one of the reasons that there's a 5 years from then till now is that it reached a particular audience who study and are interested in the history of sport, as the three of us and many of our colleagues are. But we weren't sure that it had reached a wider audience, that there's some really important things going on here that talk about sport and physical activity and recreation and embodied human movement in a variety of ways, but that we wanted other people to engage with this conversation that we'd started at Aotearoa. And that's when we started thinking, well, maybe this can have a life elsewhere, which is when we first had our conversations with Wade and Fernwood. And some important things evolved out of that. The introduction of Janice very much took the lead in that is in this book is very different. Some important people who are a part, and I know Christine's going to talk about this, an important person who is a part of what we did 5 years ago is not a part of this collection, though his influence is significant over this collection. And we found some new people from New Zealand, from the United States, who broadened what we did. So I thought it was important to talk about the life of this project, that this is an organic, as all books are, an organic process. And we're really proud of the book that's come out of it. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, great. Yeah, I want to pick up where Russell left off talking about the process, just acknowledging what it meant. I think for me, for all of us, is that this project really did come full circle. It did start as through a workshopping event, and we all got to sit with each other. And all of the authors in this book, except for one, we did invite another author, and I'll talk about her in a minute, but we did invite another author once we moved this to a book publication form. But sitting together and having the opportunity for multiple days, sit in a room and listen and learn from each other. So we have all been involved in every one of these chapters in various ways. And so we had the opportunity to present, to get feedback, and to engage. And then, of course, through editorial stages, we had that opportunity again. One really important aspect of this project, I think that was important for all of us as the editors, as the authors, was we had Eugene Arkin, a residential school survivor, as part of the workshop, and he was integral in I think all of our thinking. He participated in the workshop in 2018. He shared his story, and we had really difficult conversations at that time and in that room. And we all developed a relationship with him through that process. And through it all, I stayed in touch with Eugene. He continues. Janice works closely with him in the Indigenous hockey spaces, and I know he's mentioned, and his importance and significance to this work is mentioned in the introduction of this project. And I want to acknowledge him and the way he has shaped my thinking. And I think a lot of I can speak for a lot of the authors to talk about how he's influenced all of our thinking, and he continues to do so every day. It's whether we think of the words and the stories that he shared with us, and the way he challenged us. He challenged us in the workshop process, and he continues to. We saw him a few weeks ago, and he continues to challenge our thinking. So I wanted to acknowledge his role in bringing this book together. Also, in terms of the authors, what I wanted to speak to was that this was the diversity, and that we come from various disciplines, but we come from different lived experiences. And there's always this question about whose labor is it? As Indigenous scholars, as Indigenous people, a lot of emotional labor is put on us, but this is really, I feel, truly a decolonizing exercise, that we have Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars. We did the hard work together, and I really appreciate it. I do want to acknowledge what a great experience it was working with Fernwood. I remember when we had that initial conversation on Zoom, and also want to acknowledge Russell. He's the one who really pushed us and just to say, we have something really good here. Let's get this out there, and let's make this accessible and get this to a wider audience. And he really led us and coordinated us and got us thinking in a whole bunch of ways. And one of I think the first conversation when we were thinking about this, where do we want to go with this? What press do we want to reach out to? And Fernwood came up right away. And I know some of the books that have come out of Fernwood Press, I think about social justice and how we wanted to make this accessible. And this gets back to the title. And I learned through this process, and I know a little bit about it, but learning more about the back and forth. And you work with the press, and you figure out titles, you figure out book covers, and you go back and forth. And like both Wade and Russell said, it was a respectful process at every step. We went back and forth on the title quite a bit, and I love where we landed, because I think it doesn't just represent the topics that are being explored, but I think it represents the commitments of the authors who are part of this collection as well. And I think that's quite significant. The last thing I'll say is, like Russell, I am fond of all of the authors in this collection. I met a lot of them I consider friends, close colleagues that I work with in sport history. I met some of them through the workshop and got to know them through that workshop and developed new relationships. And one person we reached out, we acknowledged early in the process what we were lacking was any perspective of voice from south of the 49th parallel and any Indigenous representation from the United States. And so we reached out to Natalie Welsh, and so she wasn't a part of the initial workshop experience. She's relatively new in her academic position as an assistant professor, and we reached out to her. And while I've never met her personally, I got to know her very well over email. I work closely on her chapter, and I think it's a wonderful contribution to this book, not just because it brings in a Cherokee perspective and some perspectives from Indigenous peoples in the States, but I think it's the storytelling methodology she introduces in this book is something I think quite powerful, and it adds I think just a really important perspective. And I know we had sort of acknowledged that something was lacking, and that was that Indigenous perspective from the States. So I'm really grateful that she joined the team and is a part of this project. So I will leave it there, and I will now pass it on to Janice.
Welcome, everyone. And I too would like to thank Fernwood for making this process pleasant, for sure. And I want to thank Russell for ushering us through this process, because we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Russell. There was a moment in time when we were trying to figure out who was gonna go first, whose name would go first in the book, and none of us wanted to go first, and we were trying to push Russell to the front, and it became what he called a race to the bottom. So I don't know how we landed on this order, but we did. And so it actually is like a real collaboration among the editors. It could have been anyone who was first author or first editor. But you know, I'd like to build on something that my colleagues were talking about, and it's about the different perspectives that are in the book. And one of the things that I really like about the book is the way in which you know, people kind of brought themselves into their work and into the book. Because when we're talking about decolonization, the undoing of colonization, people are working through it in their own ways. And I do recall being at the workshop, and one of the things that we struggled with when we talk about it in the introduction is, what do we do as sport historians? You know, like, how do we contribute to decolonization? Because oftentimes I think, you know, most historians feel like their work is stuck on pages, and it's hard to know like what kind of impact your work actually has beyond the pages. And so it was really neat being in a workshop, just listening to people's stories and what they really cared about and what brought them to the table in the first place. And sometimes it's, you know, where people lived and they really thought deeply about where they lived. Sometimes it's an experience that they had, you know, that they were continually working through. Sometimes it's, you know, a much broader issue that they really wanted to work through because of their own lived experience. And that was really meaningful. So it was really neat, you know, just seeing what it was that people were bringing to the table and how they were trying to work through it through the space of sport history. But the other thing that I find really neat about this book too is just that people really wanted to do something, right? And I do recall, you know, some of the conversations that we were having was like what can we do beyond like the work that we do, like as sport historians? Like how do we affect change? And for sure, we affect change in the classroom, because, you know, we're in the classroom and we're working with all of these young students, and they come with their own perspectives and their own lives, and, you know, we have an ability to enter into a conversation with them and shape that. A lot of the times the work that we do doesn't often get translated into the classroom, but we try and do that as much as we can. And then of course there's the work that we do through our writing. But you know, there's also like our lives outside of sport history, of the work that we do in universities. And you know, we struggle with how do we do that? And so part of the conversation that we had with this book, and part of the reason for doing it too, is just to get people thinking about like how do we decolonize through sport? How can we get sport to be part of the process of decolonization, of undoing the process of colonization? And because it is really complex, it is really, really messy. And, you know, and there's all sorts of different ways of doing it. And so this book, in a way, brings together those conversations, which I think is really neat. And also, it's, you know, and I'm really happy, and I think my colleagues are really happy to be here tonight too, because, you know, as academics and as people who have a platform, not the same as like high profile athletes, but you know, but we have our own platform. We can create space, you know, to make change, because there's a lot of work that's happening on the ground. And that's one of the things that we write about, right? Like people are doing decolonizing work every day, like every single day of their life. And they don't feel like they're doing it, I'm sure, because, you know, they feel like they're just doing a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting. And sometimes it is just so hard. It's hard to see the change that you make. And so we recognize that, and I'm really excited because like when we have a platform and we have this space, we can call up other people who are on the ground, who are doing this work every day, who can come and talk about their own work. And one of the exciting things that we're doing here tonight is inviting our colleagues from the Manitoba Aboriginal Sport and Recreation Circle to come and talk about the book that they did, and to talk about the genesis and how it came to be. Because I think work like ours in decolonizing sport isn't just about us, and it isn't just about the people that we write about, it's about creating space, right? So we can all enter into dialogue and share what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it. And for me, that is the true decolonizing work I think that we're trying to do. So if I could I call out my friend Carrera? Okay, so I'm going to call up Carrera. Carrera is going to take the microphone over there. And the microphone is yours, Carrera, and you've got about 4 or 5 minutes.
Perfect. Good evening, everyone. This is really exciting to be here. It's exciting because we're having these conversations publicly, and it matters so much because there are so many stories that we have yet to tell. And my executive director is here, and so she's going to hate what I'm about to say, but yes, I know, you're smiling now. But the birth of a history of excellence came out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it seemed like that would not be the time to write a book. It seemed like that would not be the time to tell the stories of Indigenous athletes, builders, and coaches. But I honor Mel here before all of us because this had been her vision for so long. And it just so happened that my current role in the organization as the North End hockey coordinator wasn't going to happen because ironically, the sport wasn't happening. Everything was closed. And so Mel had rallied us into her office and she said, Carrera, I have an idea. What if we wrote a book? And what if we made sure that this book involved the lived experiences of Indigenous stories that have never been told before, ones that have been excluded from mainstream publications, that, you know, perhaps you could walk these aisles here or these halls and you could open up books about athletes, but you may never find these individuals or teams in this book. And I said, Mel, you are crazy, but let's do this. And I said, how long do we have? She said, you have 11 months. And so from, I believe it was October, we had the privilege of connecting with Janice, and I had the privilege of meeting Janice and sharing in her passion for telling these stories. And so the process just took care of itself. What ended up happening is we ended up meeting people. We ended up serving our networks. Who do we know that has a story and that wants to be told? Now, this is a tenuous process because not everyone is comfortable sharing their story. And the determinant was not a gold medal. It wasn't standing on a podium somewhere internationally. It wasn't like that at all, actually. It was how are they affecting and impacting change for those in their community? And oftentimes it was, you know, oh, my neighbor, oh, my friend, oh, my uncle, oh, my aunt. Have you heard about what they've done? They coach hockey in their community. Their story is worth telling. And so we compiled a list of probably well over 100 athletes, builders, and coaches. And we just started to give them a platform to share their experiences with sport, whether they were positive and whether they were not. And we didn't want to curate them. We didn't want to edit them in a way that didn't speak to who they felt they were in that moment in time. We just wanted to let them live. And at first, that book was nerve-wracking to produce. We weren't sure how it was received, but it was so well received. It was well received by everyone. And the premise was that it was accessible, that you could go to a coffee table and find it, you go to a local library and it would be there, that they would start to incorporate it in curriculums so that people understood and were learning about the real experiences of Indigenous peoples with sports. And not just hockey, but roller derby and arm wrestling and all of the things that you may not necessarily think about. And what I'll leave with is just with this, that the response that we received from A History of Excellence has inspired us then to write a second volume. And please be clear, it is not myself and or Mel and or Janice saying, ladies and gentlemen, volume 2. It's actually the communities themselves saying, you forgot my niece. You forgot the chief of our community. They once did this and you need to tell everybody. And not only do you need to tell everybody, you need to preserve these stories in public record so they are available for Indigenous and non-Indigenous audiences. And that was our ultimate goal. It was exciting, it was fun, it was scary to be truthful. And guess what? We're gonna do it all over again. Thank you.
What do we do now, John?
Well, there is time for questions from the audience. So if anybody in the audience does have a question, feel free to put up your hand. or a comment or anything you might like to add.
About either of the books.
I'm just wondering I'm just wondering, what are you hoping that this book will kind of lead to or change in the world? Anybody?
Why are you both looking at me?
Okay.
Both ways, try to get out of it. I think it's ongoing conversations. I think that's what's important. I was thinking about pulling this book together, and I was chatting with some grad students at U of M today about when I first started to study Indigenous sport history. There was so few. Janice was a PhD student. I came in as a master's student and went on to do my PhD. And basically it was welcome to the Indigenous sport history session at our main conference. And it's always been the same 3, 4, 5 of us. And when it came time to have this conversation or to plan the workshop, there's many more people. We kind of like met along the way. And so the interest in 2018, just this growing interest, and hopefully there's a next volume, and we have more authors, we have more people interested, because I think for me, I work in the field of, I work in sport history and I work in Indigenous studies, and it's always, I kind of feel marginalized in all walks of life. And when I say, oh, I do Indigenous sport, and people not really understanding really how significant sport is in our lives. And that there are some really important lessons to be learned, not only lessons to be learned in talking about Indigenous sport history and decolonization and sport, but that, whether we use revitalization, resurgence, like this is a really important space for our youth, and to think about Indigenous nationhood and self-determination, and that we start to connect those dots, because I think for too long sport has kind of been removed from those conversations around decolonization and self-determination. And so just bringing more people into these conversations, and we'll go from 4 to 14 to 24 next year, and we'll just keep growing and bringing more in. Sorry, I didn't turn my phone.
Okay, you wanna go?
No, go after you.
I think for me, there's a lot of good work out there that explores sport as a form of colonization, and there's a lot of good work that tries to unpack that, right? And I think this book is a contribution to that dialogue. But more specifically, I like the fact that this is, in a public space, not stuck behind a paywall like in an academic journal. Most of it is accessible, like in terms of language. And the way I read things is not the way like other people read things. So I would find it like good bedtime reading, but like other people might not make it past the first page. But I think it's accessible, and for me that's like a really good thing, because I do believe that we are at a moment in time, and it's funny because when we did the journal and the workshop 5 years ago now, and I wasn't ever sure if this thing would come into print, and you came back around to the conversation, and I was like, really? Are we going to put that as a book? But times have changed. I mean, we've gone through COVID. I think we all feel that there's been like some sort of massive shift in the world, and I do believe that people are ready, and they are already having conversations about sport and what needs to change. And I think this is an important part of that contribution to the broader dialogue for me. When I think about sport, my head is always on Indigenous sport, and I think about the TRC, and I think there has to be a real kind of truth telling about sport and colonization, and also about decolonization. So for me, at least now I can go and say, no, actually, like there is a book out there that talks about sport and decolonization. And like Christine was saying, it can contribute to the conversation that way beyond the academic walls. So.
Wayne started by saying that lots of people, when they think about sport, they don't think about the kinds of issues that are raised in this book. And I think that's a real, I think it's a shame, but I think it's a real advantage. That if the story is told right, and I think they are in this book, sport becomes what is perceived as a place of interest, a safe space to start getting into things that in other parts of people's lives may be hard for them to have those conversations. I accept and acknowledge that that's a particularly settler position, but that's the position I come from. So I see it as getting people where they are potentially and maybe taking them somewhere else. And I think the verb tense on the cover of the book is suggestive of the process that this is about decolonizing, not being decolonized, and seeing it as a process. And the other thing that I think is interesting for me and is important for me, and someone asked me this question in sort of an interview. I don't know how I used to said it in those ways, an interview that someone had with me about the book earlier this week. And the person interviewing me said, so there's people's storytelling in the book. And then there's more sort of evidence-based work. How do you sort of meld those together? And I said, well, and my response, because it was somewhat heated, but was that we don't need to, we, mostly you, don't need to draw those boundaries. That I don't care whether you're a biomechanist or a physiologist or however you gather data or whatever you think of as data. Ultimately, our job is to tell stories. And do something meaningful with those. And I think sport is, especially historically, is innately drawn to storytelling, oftentimes to nostalgia and mythologizing, and decolonizing as part of getting at those mythologies and that nostalgia. But I think that's some of the important work that this collection does for me.
Can I ask a question? Okay, Russell.
Yes, Janice.
Okay, so Russell was at the helm of getting us here. Do you have a vision for a follow-up book?
Tomorrow.
I think that's a question for Wayne. I'm still waiting for the movie rights to be sold. I'll be played by someone much taller. I mentioned my height twice now. I don't know why. Got some things to work through later. I don't have a vision for a second. I have a vision. It's horribly self-mythologizing now. I would love it if decolonizing is suggestive of a process, then continuing to find ways to add to the stories that are being told, in whether it's another book, whether it's some other medium, is important. That we've all made a commitment to being part of that process. I'm happy to do another book, Wayne, if you like.
I'm there.
Sign the contract now.
Any other questions locally at all?
When's your next book coming out, Claire? No pressure, but whet appetites.
Another year.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no further questions, I can turn things over to you folks if you have any closing comments or anything you might like to say, and then I'll pop up at the end with some procedural notes. I'm done.
It has been a pleasure working with my colleagues on this, and all of the people who are just part of the workshop and then stayed through the process and then joined on through the process right to the very end. Working with a number of people on a project can be really, really difficult, but this one was seamless, and it was so much fun. So I want to thank my colleagues for being who they are.
We have another question.
Oh.
John disappeared.
Oh, there's another question.
I know, keeping you on your toes.
So I'm intrigued about the book, and is it appropriate to ask you to read a little bit? A short thing to sort of say, hey, this is a really great book, maybe you should buy it. They don't know what to.
We believe the last part. I've
Yeah.
conveniently not brought my reading glasses up here.
Oh, shit, I-
I have contacts in for distance.
Just a little snippet of something you think is absolutely fabulous.
Well, yeah, give me a minute, I'll find it.
It's all good.
Yeah. I'm like,
Something narrow it down to 2 or 3 pages.
how about? This looks like a good one, right? This book. Basically, I think is a long thesis of this book. That's what I'm guessing. I picked the middle of the intro chapter. Sorry. Oh, we talked about all that now that I'm looking at it.
You wanna just start?
Okay. All right, so yeah, I'll just start with the opening of the introduction. How's that? Okay, every generation has at least one defining moment that changes the way they understand the world around them. There's no telling what this defining moment might be, but its impact is so great that it forever and irrevocably changes society. Hopefully that change is for the better. In Canada, one of those defining moments took place on May 27th, 2021. On that day, media reported the discovery of a mass unmarked grave at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, situated on Secwepemc First Nation in British Columbia. It was once the largest Indian residential school in Canada, with an annual intake of about 500 students. The Catholic-run, federally funded institution opened in 1890 and closed in 1978, during which time thousands of children and youth passed through its doors, with many never leaving. Media explained that a survey of the area had been completed using ground-penetrating radar. The results confirmed disturbances to a large tract of land that was, reading this, okay, that was thought to be 215 graves, mostly, if not all, filled with children. Community members always had a knowing of there being unmarked graves at Kamloops. These burials were never documented by officials over the school's 88-year history, suggesting that generations of teachers and administrators knew about the site, for it had accumulated so many disturbances. School officials somehow created a silent institutional memory to protect what they were doing there. Without an official written record, Indigenous community memory could be ignored and the tragically neglected until more reliable evidence came along. Had there been a written record from a school, church, or government worker, alarm bells would have been sounded immediately upon its revelation, demonstrating how one way of knowing, settler knowledge conveyed through writing, still trumps another way of knowing, Indigenous knowledge conveyed through oral histories. Canadians responded all at once in a panic, as if they had been roused from a deep sleep, convinced their world had turned without warning into a living nightmare. They stumbled about, shocked and confused, wondering how this could happen in a place like Canada. They scrambled for information, not knowing where to turn for insight and support. Media, co-workers, friends, neighbors, strangers, whoever felt like asking, implored Indigenous people to step forward to explain what all of this meant, as if Indigenous people were responsible for helping everyone else deal with the trauma they were suddenly experiencing, as if Indigenous people should carry this burden for others. The discovery from May 2021 is known today as Kamloops 215, or simply 215. The number being enough to denote the horrors that took place at that school, yet there had been public warnings that this day might be coming. In 2015, after its 7-year investigation into the history of the Indian residential school system, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada produced a suite of detailed reports documenting the system's history, including the problem of missing children in unmarked burials. One report confirmed at least 3,200 deaths in the schools. However, TRC Justice Chair Justice Murray Sinclair explained that the number was probably much higher since the report included only cases mentioned in official written records, and record keeping in the system was notoriously poor. Through the summer and fall of 2021, more unmarked graves at other former school sites were identified, driving the total number upwards. By September 2022, one university website put the number of unmarked graves throughout the country at 2,200. Keep in mind that these were mostly children taken by the state with the intent to, quote, improve them. Sport was an important feature in the Indian residential school system in Canada, as well as in the United States and Australia, where colonial authorities also created segregated institutions to reorient Indigenous children's beliefs and practices to support the settler state. The TRC includes several sections on sports and games in its multi-volume report, showing the far-reaching connection between sports, education, and colonialism. For instance, the history, part 1, described how the British notion of muscular Christianity equated competitive individualism with manliness, resource exploitation, and nationhood, the building blocks of early modern capitalism. Novels such as the widely popular Tom Brown's School Days, first published in 1857, helped to disseminate and embed these values throughout the British Empire. Sport was not just about having fun, it was about building proper manly strength to subdue the land while protecting God and country. Thus, by the late 19th century, muscular Christianity significantly shaped people's ideas about how sports should be played and who could play them. This included sports in Canadian Indian residential schools. The history, part 2, carries that analysis forward to the 20th century, where school, church, and government officials tapped into the propaganda value of sports and games to advance their objectives. During this era, we see an increase in competitions against white schools, more sporting tours, more photographs, brochures, and reports depicting the schools as healthy and safe educational spaces for young boys and girls, as if they were cheerful country clubs for children and youth rather than the dangerous, poverty-stricken workhouses they were. Sport was clearly an important facet in growing of schooling and assimilation. The TRC helped to bring that discussion into the public realm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that reading, Christine. So if there are no further questions, we will move along to the signing portion of the evening. So please do feel free to come and join us just at the table beside the cash desk. We'll all wander over in that general direction. We have plenty of copies of Decolonizing Sport there, and you can have them signed by the co-editors if you wish. Feel free to have them signed before you pay for them. Just please do remember to pay for the book before you leave. We also have many copies of Russell Field's A Night at the Gardens as well as Reclaiming Tom Longboat, Indigenous Self-Determination in Canadian Sport by Janice Forsyth, which no less an authority than Christina Bonsoin calls a genuine project of reclamation. We also, of course, have copies of A History of Excellence. So please do avail yourself of any of these books. We're so thrilled that you could join us here tonight. So thank you so much to Wayne at Fernwood for arranging this evening. Thank you to the co-editors, Janice Forsyth, Christina Bonsoin, and Russell Field for joining us here this evening too, and for sharing with us. And of course to Carrera Lamoureux and all at MASRC for joining us and for their own incredible work too. Thank you all for coming tonight. Please have a wonderful evening.